Greetings, comrades! We are finally wrapping up the 7th level of the Russian Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. The end is near. Are you ready for the truth? What if Earth had more than one satellite? How does panel housing suck the life out of its residents? Why does George Soros want to destroy Russia? And how did Mikhail Gorbachev manage to organize a rebellion against himself? Let's go. The Doctrine of Earth's Lost Moons. Theories about Earth's lost moons tell us that our planet may have had not one, but several moons in the past which were eventually destroyed or fell to Earth. Incidentally, Helena Blavatsky, whom I mentioned in previous episodes, actively promoted a similar theory. In her Theosophy, she introduced the concept of the lunar chain. The moon was the remnant of an earlier incarnation of Earth that gave birth to a new planet. However, modern followers have slightly modified this legend, resulting in the doctrine of the lost moons of Earth. Since the 1990s, this doctrine has been promoted within Slavic neo-paganism, Radnaveria. According to this doctrine, the Earth, called Midgard, originally had 3 satellites with different orbital periods: Lelia, 7 days, Fata, 13 days, and the Moon, 29 days. Each satellite was a sort of a protector for a great race that inhabited the Earth. More than 110,000 years ago, Lelia was destroyed by the god Tarch-Dashbog in order to demolish the bases of the dark forces located on it that were preparing to conquer the Earth. The fall of its fragments caused the first Great Flood and the destruction of the mythical northern continent of Daria, which was inhabited by the first great race. About 13,000 years ago, the second satellite, Fata, was also destroyed, leading to the second flood and the destruction of Atlantis and the second race, the Atlanteans. Accordingly, the current moon patronizes the human race, or more precisely, the great Slavic Aryans, but no one knows when its cycle will end or if it will repeat the fate of its sisters. Tax power vertical. The next theory concerns a term we hear every day in the news about Russian politics: vertical of power. The phrase strengthening the vertical of power usually refers to, I quote, measures that improve the manageability and accountability of the authorities of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation to the federal center, of local self-government bodies to the constituent entities, and so on. Boring. This theory, however, asserts that this entire vertical structure was invented solely to siphon funds from the regions to the insatiable capital. Thus, in the early 2000s, a tax reform was carried out that significantly increased the dependence of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation on the federal center. Now, all regions of the Russian Federation receive funds not directly from their own taxpayers, but through an intermediary, the federal center. On the one hand, this keeps local elites from having too much influence on tax control, which reduces the chance of corruption at the local level. On the other hand, the federal center now gets about 65 to 70% of tax revenues. Even wealthy oil and gas producing regions can't really do much on their own when it comes to handling their money, which makes them more likely to follow the rules. If the region even so much as shows any sign of political disobedience, it can supposedly be punished by having its finances cut off. Supporters of this theory are convinced that Moscow is effectively parasitizing on the body of a huge country, sucking all the juices out of it and establishing total control over the population and business. Some even believe that at the top of this vertical structure is not Moscow, but rather a kind of shadow government, which, according to the classic theory, is located somewhere to the west. Through complex financial mechanisms and budget rules, money from Russia goes straight to Western financial institutions such as the IMF or the US Federal Reserve. So, this entire vertical structure is built solely for the purpose of collecting tribute from the colony that Russia has become. Mental impact of panel housing. Since you are my subscribers, you probably all love Khrushchevkas, Stalinkas and Brezhnevkas. But there has long been a theory circulating on the internet that living in prefabricated buildings, characteristic of many post-Soviet cities, can have a significant psychological impact on their residents. Negative impact, of course. According to the theory, the mass construction of identical prefabricated buildings during the Soviet and post-Soviet periods was part of an experiment or conspiracy aimed at completely erasing individual differences and creating an average Soviet citizen. Conspiracy theorists claim that identical apartments in identical buildings in identical neighborhoods were designed to eradicate feelings of ownership and personal space. This would make people more dependent on the collective and the state. The grayness, straight lines, and lack of architectural embellishments were deliberately designed to create an oppressive atmosphere. The excellent acoustic of Hrushchevka constantly reminds you that you are never alone. All this suppresses creativity, reduces critical thinking, and drives people into apathy, making them more passive and controllable. The standardized layout of apartments and neighborhoods also made the special services work much easier. Knowing the layout of a building made it easier to conduct surveillance, eavesdrop, and monitor residents' movements. Some argue that the shape and proportions of paneled buildings create negative energy fields that suck the energy out of the people living in them. And if that wasn't enough to break someone, certain substances were added to the concrete panels or reinforcing frame, or special elements were built in, designed to have a psychotronic effect or suppress the will. This fits well with the theory about the phenolic houses, don't you agree? They added something dangerous to the concrete to reduce costs, so why not add something else to control us? Rum Babas for Zhdanov. The 872-day blockade of Leningrad is one of the most horrific chapters of World War II. Mass starvation led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the city. According to one theory, while ordinary citizens starved and died from the blockade, lavish feasts were held in besieged Leningrad, specifically in Smolny, where Andrei Zhdanov, the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee, lived and worked. These feasts featured exquisite dishes, including caviar, crab, ham, fish, and peaches, which were brought in by special planes. Of course, the legendary rum babas were also present. Writer Daniil Granin first reported this in his book The Man Who Was Not From Here. Granin recounts being shown a photograph of confectioners in white caps bustling about a large baking sheet covered with rum babas. The cakes were allegedly intended for Smolny, the military council, and Zhdanov personally, who loved them very much. He noted that the photograph was taken in December 1941, when factory workers received 250 grams of bread per day, and other employees and children received only 125 grams. The party leadership's lack of hunger during the blockade is confirmed by the absence of any mention of starvation deaths among representatives of the district, city, or regional committees of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks in the archives. Additionally, archive evidence suggests that in December 1941, one of Leningrad's confectionery factories really was producing rum cakes, Viennese pastries, and chocolate. However, some diaries of people who experienced the blockade confirm that rum cakes could be bought with Russian cards at theater buffets, not just for the party elite. Furthermore, the claim that the rum babas or peaches were intended for Zhdanov personally seems doubtful, since he was known to suffer from diabetes. There is also a theory that the photographs at the confectionery factory were taken for propaganda purposes, to show that the situation in Leningrad is not so bad. Alternatively, the products may have been intended for hospitals and pilots who were entitled to extra rations. But in any case, even if there really was no feast, the diet of the party elite in Smolny certainly differed from that of ordinary citizens dying in cold apartments. Novodvorskaya's hellish ordeal. Valeria Novodvorskaya, a politician, was a very controversial figure and the subject of thousands of memes. Some consider her a freedom fighter, while others see her as extremely eccentric, bordering on crazy. But the fact is that both descriptions may be accurate. Take a look at these photos. On the left is Valeria Ilyinichna in her youth. On the right is the same woman just 10 years later. What could have changed a person beyond recognition? Perhaps Soviet punitive psychiatry. Novodvorskaya began her dissident activities in her youth. At the age of 19, she was arrested by the KGB for anti-Soviet agitation, specifically distributing leaflets. In 1970s, she was placed in Kazan psychiatric hospital with a diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia and paranoid personality disorder. This was a classic method of dealing with dissidents. She was forcibly sent to psychiatric hospitals several more times with fabricated diagnoses. Patients in such hospitals found themselves completely powerless and totally dependent on doctors and guards, with fewer rights than prisoners in penal colonies. Novodvorskaya recalled that patients in the hospital were beaten, tied up, tortured with a dental drill, and injected with sulfazine, gaseous oxygen, and haloperidol. Electroshock therapy and induced insulin shock were also used. A zombie emerges from the special prison, just the outer shell of a former human being, burned out from within by boundless hatred, extreme humiliation, and suffering beyond the comprehension of a rational being. But this zombie is also forced to lead an afterlife. Death in Lefortovo was an unattainable blessing, an exquisite rarity, a fairy tale dream. It could only be dreamed of. Later, Valeria Novodvorskaya was often called a freak, for her strange voice, for her bluntness, and for her overly direct wording, for her very amusing personal style, after all. But her excess weight can easily be explained by hormonal imbalance after horse doses of drugs, her eccentricity by a broken psyche after 10 years of hell. What if she wasn't born that way, but made that way? Hell icons. Adapistные icons, also known as black icons, are legendary icons beneath whose visible layer of paint lies an image of the devil or demons. That is, the word literally means icons painted in hell, or for hell. The first mentions of them date back to the life of Basil the Blessed in the 16th century. According to legend, one day, the saint suddenly threw a stone at the revered icon of the Mother of God at the Varvarsky gates in Moscow. When the outraged crowd pounced on him, Basil shouted, "The devil is painted there." He claimed that evil forces had replaced the icon long ago, and ordered the top layer of paint to be scraped off. Underneath, an image of the devil was indeed found. Rumors and legends about corrupted icons became particularly widespread in the 19th century during a period of heightened religious prejudice against the backdrop of industrialization. Newspapers of the time were full of reports of unclean images being found in various regions. According to folk legends, such icons were spread by enemies of the church, Freemasons, Jews or sectarians, to undermine orthodox dogma. The creation of adapistные icons was considered a form of black magic. The technique was described as follows. First, the icon painter painted the devil on the board and let it dry. Then they covered it with a new layer of primer and painted the canonical saint on top. The result was a spiritual changeling. A person prays to God, but in reality his prayer goes to the devil hidden under the paint. It was believed that such icons were given to enemies to bring misfortune or drive an entire family mad. However, despite numerous references in historical sources and folk legends, not a single authentic example of such an icon has survived, causing many researchers to doubt their existence. Some consider all this to be a tale invented by cunning merchants. Allegedly, they could secretly scratch the paint of the buyer's icon, discover horns there, and immediately sell a new clean icon at triple the price to the frightened peasant. State of prisons in the 19th century Russia. If you want to see something as close to hell on earth as possible, take a look at 19th century Russian prisons. Some believe that the horrors of the Gulag were the first of their kind. However, historical records tell a different story. Most Tsarist prisons were rotten, dilapidated barracks. Prisoners suffered from overcrowded cells and were not separated by gender, age or the severity of their crimes. The sick were kept with the healthy, leading to frequent epidemics. Typhus, typhoid fever, scurvy and tuberculosis decimated the population. The state provided prisoners with almost no food. They survived only on the charity of compassionate citizens, known as alms. There was virtually no medical staff in prisons. Prisoners slept on dirty floors, in corridors, or even in the yard, often in chains, which exacerbated injuries and infections. Conditions in Siberian katorgas were terrible too. Hundreds of people, including women and children, were forced to walk thousands of kilometers under guard. They suffered from cold, hunger, and filth. Many died along the way. In his book about Russian prisons, Englishman Arthur Griffiths wrote that only a handful of the 2,561 children in 1881 survived the Siberian road to katorga. Some modern conspiracy theories suggest that Tsarist prisons were testing grounds for secret psychological experiments or drug trials, foreshadowing the methods of the NKVD. However, this is a case where conspiracy theories are not particularly necessary. The reality is already horrific enough. There is, however, an interesting detail. Some claim that in order to survive this horror, the prisoners created their own state within a state with brutal rules. These rules have come down to us today as the Thieves' Code, which all prisoners in Russian prisons still obey. Russians are not Slavs. I discussed this pseudoscientific myth invented by the Pole Franciszek Duchinsky in detail in this video. Take some time to watch it. You can also participate in the massive shitstorm in the comments. 4,500 is no joke. Lenin's Ziggurat. Lenin's Mausoleum, designed by architect Alexei Shusev, was built in 1924. Take a closer look at its shape. It is neither Russian nor classical in style. Rather, it is a stepped pyramid. For some reason, it looks like an exact copy of the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, where some bloody rituals were performed. I mean, the emphasized connection with pagan rituals and the symbolism of ancient civilizations align pretty well with the Soviet government's anti-church ideology. But conspiracy theorists claim that in their struggle against the church, the Bolsheviks did not just reject religion, rather they created their own dark cult. They believe the mausoleum serves as both a monument and an energy object that influences the surrounding space. Some believe that Shusev based his design on the Pergamon altar, which the Bible directly refers to as the throne of Satan. Why is this ziggurat still in the middle of Red Square? Some believe that it emits negative energy affecting the Russian people. Others believe that the mausoleum controls the minds of the masses. Finally, some say that the mausoleum was built as a sacrificial altar. Who was sacrificed? The pioneers, of course, who were brought in droves from all over the country to see grandfather Lenin's body. I was there too, on a school trip. I was lucky, I wasn't chosen as a sacrifice and escaped unscathed and unchanged. Or was I? Soros Plan. And what discussion of global conspiracies would be complete without him? The world's chief villain. You all know George Soros, the financier, investor and philanthropist whose name has become a household word. Officially, he has donated a total of $32 billion to charity, but unofficially he has spent this money for his own hidden political purposes. Many believe he played an important role in the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe during the Velvet Revolutions of 1989. As for Russia, some believe that George had a separate, mega cunning plan in store. The Soros Foundation operated officially in Russia from 1995 to 2015, when it was banned and declared an undesirable organization. It has supported science, education and NGOs, but as it later turned out, its activities resulted in a large-scale brain drain from the country. It literally vacuumed up talented personnel and pulled them out of the country with grants. These are not my words, they're a quote from Vladimir Putin. After the 1998 crisis in Russia, it is believed that Soros did not forgive the country for failing to return his investments. In retaliation, he launched a campaign to destabilize Russia. In 2023, Nikolai Patrushev, secretary of the Russian Security Council, stated outright that Soros's American funds had developed a full manual for dismantling Russia. The Soros plan, for example, included creating numerous organizations that would infiltrate Russian society and organize protests or even a velvet revolution at the right moment. I mean, back in the day, Soros allocated money for things like writing Russian history textbooks for children, and it's obvious what worldview prevailed in them. But don't think this is just purely Russian paranoia. George Soros is hated by conservatives all around the world. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan once said that Soros is the linchpin of a Jewish conspiracy to divide and destabilize Turkey and other countries. Nigel Farage, the leader of the British Brexit Party, claims that Soros is actively encouraging migrants to flood Europe and is in many ways the main threat to the entire Western world. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has declared war on Soros altogether, passing a package of Stop Soros laws. Orban claims that the billionaire has a secret plan to destroy nation-states by mixing their population in the melting pot of globalism. Navalny is the Kremlin's Mandela. To avoid straying too far from the topic at hand, let us conclude our discussion of contemporary politics for today. For the record, Alexei Navalny is recognized by the Russian Federation as an extremist and a terrorist, as are all organizations and individuals associated with him. So, for some time there was a theory in Russia that this terrorist and extremist was not a fierce oppositionist, nor a puppet of the West, but rather a Kremlin project, a so-called Plan B, and that his popularity was deliberately cultivated in the image of Nelson Mandela, including his imprisonment. The idea was that in the event of unrest or revolution, Russia would be led by a popular figure who, at first glance, could not be associated with the previous regime. In reality, however, he would be completely loyal to the previous regime. The supporters of the theory cited his rapid rise to popularity in the early 2010s, he seemingly appeared out of nowhere, and the fact that he was allowed to participate in the Moscow mayoral election. Pro-government structures even shared the necessary signatures of municipal deputies with him for election admission. Finally, his supporters' investigations were based on documents impossible for ordinary people to obtain, such as billing records and closed registers. It was believed that one Kremlin tower, for example, the special services, was leaking compromising information about another tower, officials or oligarchs, through the opposition. This theory was great, but unfortunately has not been relevant since 2024. Kozyrev Mirrors. At the previous level I told you about Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev, who believed that time was a physical quantity. Academician Vlail Kaznachev and his colleagues in Novosibirsk decided to test Kozyrev's theories in practice and created devices called Kozyrev Mirrors. These mirrors are special structures usually made of aluminum alloys and often in the form of spirals or cylinders. What happens inside these mirrors? It is believed that Kozyrev mirrors can reflect and focus not only light, but also time and various types of radiation, including bioinformation fields. If a person is placed inside the Kozyrev mirror, they may gain access to the Earth's information field and develop clairvoyant abilities. These mirrors affect human consciousness and mental state. Test subjects experienced altered states of consciousness, feelings of leaving the body, visions of historical events, dizziness and fear. Supporters of Kozyrev's mirrors claim that because time flows differently inside the devices, they can be used to treat psychosomatic illnesses and balance the human biofield. The most unexplainable thing about them happened in the early 90s. During an experiment on telepathic transmission of symbols between Novosibirsk and Dixon, a glow similar to the northern lights appeared around the laboratory, and an unidentified flying object was seen hovering in the sky. Kaznachev and his supporters patented these objects, though only the designs and not their effects. Official science claims that aluminum can reflect heat and light, but not time. Battle Mole. The battle mole is not what you might imagine when you picture a heavily armed, furry creature. Think of a nuclear submarine that doesn't float in water, but rather burrows its way underground through thick granite behind enemy lines. That's a battle mole. It is theorized that such a device was developed in the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century. The concept was borrowed from the Germans and their Midgard serpent, then refined. Thanks to its nuclear reactor, the mole could literally dig into the ground and move at a speed of about 7 km per hour. The most interesting thing is that this is entirely conceivable. For example, open US patents describe nuclear machines that melt rock from heat from a reactor, leaving smooth tunnel walls. Why not militarize such a machine? Yes, the problem remains that it can only be used on its own continent, therefore it would be useless for the US in a war against the USSR, but quite useful for the USSR against Europe. It could penetrate enemy territory underground and destroy communications and command posts. It could even cause earthquakes with nuclear charges. According to one of the most daring theories, underground moles were planned to be secretly delivered by ships to the US coast to lay nuclear charges in seismically active areas. The goal was to provoke destructive earthquakes that would be attributed to natural disasters. The moles could also transport paratroopers who would jump out at the right moment at the enemy's most vulnerable points. According to some accounts, the tests ended in disaster when the underground vehicle exploded near Mount Blagodat in the Urals. The entire crew, including Commander Colonel Semyon Budnikov, died instantly. The machine itself, which had a nuclear reactor on board, was walled up in the rock. Following this disaster, the project was shut down and all related materials were destroyed or classified. Mavrodi's stock generation. You surely remember Sergey Mavrodi, the creator of the largest financial pyramid scheme in Russian history. Few people know, however, that his most daring project took place in the West, but he defrauded hundreds of thousands of Americans and Europeans. We are talking about the Stock Generation Project, launched in 1998. Mavrodi registered it under the name of his 18-year-old sister-in-law Oksana Pavlyuchenko. For the late 1990s, it was extraordinary. A virtual stock exchange where shares of non-existent companies were traded. Players were promised returns of up to 200% per year. Mavrodi was no fool. He immediately posted a warning on his website stating that these shares were not real but simply fiction, a game of chance. Apparently, however, the visitors to the site were fools. The number of people deceived in the US and Western Europe officially amounted to 250,000 and unofficially to several million. The website operated on the principle of a classic pyramid scheme, where payments to old investors were provided by the influx of new ones. In 2000, it collapsed after the US Securities and Exchange Commission accused it of fraud and intervened. The most interesting part began in court. The SEC filed a lawsuit but lost in the first round. The Boston court ruled that since users had been warned that it was all a game, there was no fraud. The decision was later overturned, but it was too late. The money had disappeared and Mavrodi was out of the FBI's reach in Russia. However, not everyone is willing to accept that they are fools who have fallen for Mavrodi's scam once again. Many supporters believe that the US government and special services deliberately destroyed the project. Sergey allegedly discovered a vulnerability in the global banking system, and the American authorities destroyed the fair distribution project, fearing competition from an uncontrolled flow of money. An even crazier theory is that Stock Generation was allowed to register and operate in Western markets for several years because it was a special services experiment, perhaps the CIA or NSA. The internet was just emerging, and someone needed to study the psychology of crowds online. How do people part with their money online? How trusting are they? That is why, despite the obvious fraud and hundreds of thousands of victims, Mavrodi was never convicted in the US. Where exactly all the money Mavrodi stole from Western users ended up is unknown. Who was really behind Mavrodi is also unknown. Classic. Satanists in the USSR. The international satanic movement is recognized as extremist and banned in Russia. But in the Soviet Union, it is believed that Satanists not only existed, but were based right in the Kremlin. The USSR was said to be the state of the Antichrist. What are the arguments? First, the October Revolution of 1917 and the creation of the USSR are linked to a secret satanic plan by Freemasons and Jews, as described in the protocols of the Elders of Zion at the beginning of the 20th century. After the revolution, the Nazis accused the Bolsheviks of Jewish Bolshevism. claiming that Lenin and Trotsky were Freemasons and Jews, and that Karl Marx created communism at the behest of the Jewish Lodge. Russian nationalists have a different interpretation. The USSR's power is satanic because its leaders killed God's anointed one and destroyed the Third Rome. They consider the mass terror organized by the Soviet Union in the first years of its rule a rehearsal for the apocalypse and part of bloody satanic rituals. The anthem, the Internationale, also contains many questionable references. For example, the lines "Arise, ye cursed ones" are interpreted as a call to fallen angels. Similarly, the phrase "No one will give us salvation, neither God nor the Tsar" is seen as a direct declaration of war on heaven. The construction of a new world without God by our own hands is an exact copy of the Antichrist program. The words "those who are nothing will become all" are a typical satanic trick, similar to "you will be like God." People also recall the monument to Judas who betrayed Christ. It was allegedly erected in Sviazhsk in 1918. There was also a magazine called Red Devil, published briefly as part of Pravda, the main newspaper of the Bolsheviks. Finally, recall what the Bolsheviks placed on the Kremlin towers: 5 pointed stars. Does that remind you of anything? The second part of the legend takes us to a more recent era. It is believed that since the 1970s the Order of Satan, or Unisat, has been operating in Moscow, Leningrad and Odessa. It included the Golden Youth, Bohemians and intellectuals who were tired of materialism. Inspired by the Western occultist Aleister Crowley, they held black masses in apartments. There were all sorts of rumors about them. Soviet patriots believed that this was a CIA plot to morally corrupt young people, along with rock music and jeans. A more daring version claims that these circles were supervised by the KGB itself, or even members of the Politburo who were seeking mystical protection for their declining power. There was talk of human sacrifices and connections with the party nomenclature, but of course these files are still kept under lock and key at Lubyanka. The Drowned of Mologa. Mologa is often called Russian Atlantis, a symbol of a vanished world. The ancient city once stood where the waters of the vast Rybinsk reservoir now splash. The Soviets built it in 1941, flooding Mologa with its population of about 5,000 to 7,000 people, as well as hundreds of villages, monasteries and settlements. In total, about 2,500 settlements of more than 130,000 people were flooded. Residents were forced to dismantle their houses log by log, float them down the river and reassemble them in a new location in exchange for meager compensation. It is believed that approximately 300 Mologa residents, mostly elderly, refused to leave their homeland. They allegedly locked themselves in their homes and chained themselves to heavy objects to die with their beloved city. This account is often supported by a reference to an NKVD report by Lieutenant Sklarov that allegedly mentioned citizens who wished to leave this life with their belongings. However, skeptics fiercely dispute this theory. They say that the reservoir did not fill up in an hour like in a disaster movie, but rather over the course of more than a month. They also claim that it was possible to simply walk away from the rising water. Sitting in the water for a week or more, waiting to be drowned by the slowly rising water level, is an odd and painful way to commit suicide. Secondly, the NKVD would hardly have allowed such a thing. The saboteurs would have been forcibly removed, possibly directly to the camps. Citizens of Mologa who survived the resettlement called it a tragedy in their memoirs, but also denied that people drowned themselves voluntarily. Mologa still sometimes partially emerges from under the water when the reservoir's level drop, and eyewitnesses claim that they not only see the remains of crosses in the water, but also sometimes hear inhuman moans. What if these are the voices of those very martyrs of Mologa? Chikatilo was performing a ritual. I already mentioned Andrei Chikatilo in this level, but just in case, let me remind you that he was the bloodiest serial killer in the history of the USSR, operating in the Rostov region. He killed between 43 and 56 people, including women, teenagers and children. He was officially found sane, and his motive was said to be sexual pleasure from committing murders. However, some believe that there is more to the story. Many of his crimes included sexual violence, dismemberment, and cannibalism, which gave rise to speculation about the ritual nature of his actions. Who was he? Was he a member of a satanic cult? Or a victim of a KGB experiment to create a super killer? What ritual did he want to complete? My Patreon subscribers will find out in an exclusive video made just for them. The Silence of Gorbachev. There are hundreds of conspiracy theories associated with perestroika and the collapse of the USSR. These theories range from the existence of a fifth column within the Communist Party and secret agreements with American intelligence agencies to alien intervention. Today, however, we will examine the most puzzling event of that period. What was Mikhail Gorbachev doing from August 19th to 21st, 1991, while tanks were rolling through Moscow? During this time, Gorbachev was said to be isolated at his residence in Faros, Crimea. According to him, he was under house arrest for 3 days, with no connection to the outside world except an old shortwave radio. However, his silence, the lack of resistance, statements, or immediate return to Moscow fueled many conspiracy theories. One common idea is that Gorbachev staged the coup to expose disloyal officials, present himself as a hero, and delay signing a new Union treaty that would have weakened his position. Another version of this theory claims that Gorbachev knew about the conspiracy in advance, allowed it to begin, and did not intervene so that the conservatives could restore order. Upon returning to power, he could maintain his image as a democratic leader. Suspicions intensified due to inconsistencies in his stories after his return. For example, how could he have known the details of the coup leaders' press conference, including Yanaev's shaking hands, if he allegedly only had access to the radio? What happened to all the special communications equipment in his cars? Why did he allow himself to be placed under house arrest in the first place? For some reason, his 32 armed personal security detail members did not engage in conflict with the GKChP delegation. Another version comes from the coup participants themselves. At the 1993 trial, some defendants, including Vice President Gennady Yanaev and Politburo member Oleg Shenin, claimed that Gorbachev had pressured them to declare a state of emergency to avoid unpopular measures, but then backed out, leaving them to take the blame. During their last meeting, allegedly he told them, "To hell with you, do whatever you want." According to Yanaev, Gorbachev personally drafted all documents concerning the GKChP prototype in March 1991. However, when they informed Gorbachev of the coup's start in August and suggested he declare a state of emergency, he refused, saying he would wait 3 days and then join them. A more complex conspiracy theory suggests secret alliance between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Supposedly, Gorbachev and Yeltsin staged the coup together to discredit the Communist Party, destroy the old system and divide power. 20 years after the events, Gorbachev admitted that he had received warnings about the impending coup. He explained his inaction by his desire to avoid bloodshed and civil war. But who knows if that was his only motivation. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petr Ilich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.